Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm author e.r.reading, and today we're going to be doing a book review of this book right here, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, and why you should read it. Alright, I cannot rave enough about this book, and it's a classic for a reason, and it's one of Jane Austen's most beloved novels. Now I'm going to go into a deep dive summary, so there will be spoilers in this video. Just if you're not into spoilers, don't watch this video. But if you are here to stay, let's dive into it. So the first line is a very commonly known line in literature, and it's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. And this starts off the whole book with that line, and it's just so important, and it weaves through the entire plot, and I could not say how complex this plot is. And people might pick it up just, oh, this is just a rom-com. And I can say that it definitely has a lot of twists and turns. And I'm going to break down the plot step by step and kind of my favorite moments throughout the books. I will leave timestamps down below so you can skip around a bit if you want to. Just a precursor, I haven't read this book before, but I did grow up watching the Jane Austen Pride and Prejudice movies, both the 1995 and the 2005 versions, in my house, and so I very much am acquainted with this, and just getting to read the characters was so amazing, and I cannot appreciate it enough. Like, it's just amazing. So we start off the book with Mrs. Bennet talking to Mr. Bennet about how she needs to marry off her daughters, one of her daughters, to this new Mr. Bingley who's just moved into Netherfield. And he's kind of joking around with her, telling her, oh, why would we need, like, we don't need that. And she's like, but our daughters will be out on the street if you don't. And through a lot of joking and we get introduced to our main protagonist, who is Elizabeth Bennet, the second oldest daughter. So we have Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. And Elizabeth is definitely smarter than a lot of her other sisters, and she connects closely with her father, and they have lots of fun making fun of their sisters, who are a little bit silly and a little bit younger, and they end up going to this ball. And we find out that Mr. Bingley is also coming to the ball, and he shows up to this ball, and his two sisters are with him. One of them is currently married to Mr. Hurst, and the other one is Caroline Bingley, and she plays a huge role. And the next person that also showed up with him is his best friend, Mr. Darcy, who is arguably one of my favorite characters in the entire novel. And they show up with a bang, and they're just arrogant, and Bingley seems pleasant enough. He's a little lightheaded, needs a lot of opinions, he's very fluid in what he believes and wants, and that kind of wavers him, but he ends up dancing with all of the girls, but dancing with Jane, the oldest, most of all out of all of them, and that makes Mrs. Bennet just pleased beyond anything. She's just so excited, and she's believing that they're going to get married after this dance. And we go through the story, and we start to become acquainted with Mr. Bingley. Jane ends up getting invited over to dinner with the sisters, and the mother says, don't take the carriage, take the horse, it's gonna rain. And she ends up with a massive cold and ends up needing to stay at Netherfield. Elizabeth ends up going to take care of her, and she gets to have a closer look at Bingley's sisters and Mr. Darcy, who was arrogant and flat out refused to dance with her at the past ball. And people just hate him. He seems really prideful and arrogant and just not a pleasant human being. And she goes to the house, and her opinions are kind of still a little upset, but we get to see a little bit of Darcy's perspective, where he watches her and he's starting to have feelings for her. And she hates him at this point in the book so much. Have some fun moments with Caroline Bingley, who just totally is trying to sabotage it and is totally into Mr. Darcy. And we just get to see that Mr. Darcy likes Lizzie and likes that she reads, and he thinks of her very accomplished. And we have this funny moment where she's sitting on the couch, and they're defining an accomplished woman, and he's telling that she needs to be a pianist and artist into crocheting, embroidery, and all this other stuff. And he's like, oh, and I find an accomplished woman is also into reading. And Elizabeth flat out closes the book that she's reading and is done with it. She's like, I refuse to be an accomplished woman in your eyes. And there are so many funny moments, and Caroline just has some zingers that are just so nasty and mean towards the Bennet family because they are seen as less in society than the Bingleys and the Darcys, which are somewhat rich, quite rich. Darcy is much richer than Bingley, however, they're both very rich. Then from there, when Jane gets better, they end up going home and beginning to live their life, and Mr. Collins, who is entailed to own the house once Mr. Bennet dies, he's their cousin, comes to dinner. And he comes to stay with them for like 2 weeks, maybe, I think it is. And he is something. He is a quirky, strange, clergy man. And he will not stop talking about his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. And she is his idol. She gave him everything, this house, this beautiful Rosings garden that he can walk in. And this means that he talks about her almost non-stop. And he annoys the Bennet family so much, but immediately when he walks into the house, he talks to Mrs. Bennet and he's like, oh, I want to make things right, so like, Jane's really pretty. And Jane is known for being very pretty. She's way prettier than any of the Bennet sisters. Lizzie's quite close, however, Jane is just a beauty. And she's like, actually, she's soon to be engaged to another man. And he's like, oh, okay. And then he sets his sights on Lizzie, which is the wrong choice. He is so stupid, and he can't. Lizzie would just be the wrong choice for him. And through all of this, we end up going to a ball at Netherfield, and he comes, and there's some disaster. Oh, I forgot to mention Wickham. We meet Officer Wickham, who is this charming, cunning guy, and he comes into Elizabeth's life and he ends up telling her these stories about Mr. Darcy and how he was done wrong by him and how he was unable to pursue his role in the church because Mr. Darcy wouldn't give him the money that his Mr. Darcy's father told him that he could have for his schooling, and Elizabeth, of course, already hates Mr. Darcy, and so this fuels her hatred, and she hates him even more. How could he rob a man of his livelihood when he has so much to give? And she goes on this rant, and she's so angry, and Jane's like, let's just be a peacemaker in this situation. Maybe one of them's, you know, like, maybe they're both just a little bit presuming of the other. And we kind of have Jane as the peacemaker, the one who never judges and is so kind, and I wish I was a Jane in real life, but I'm more like Lizzie and very judgy. However, we go on to this ball, and Bingley and Jane are dancing, they're having fun, but pretty much every Bennet, except for Lizzie, makes a fool of themselves at this ball, and this is not exactly a great thing. And her mother's drinking and gossiping and just loud, and Lydia and Kitty are just flirts and jumping around and dancing with everyone and loud, and Mary plays the piano so terribly, and her dad stops her in the middle of her playing, which is, oh. I can't even talk about the societal differences in this book. And Jane and Lizzie are the only ones who actually behave themselves quite well, and Lizzie ends up actually getting startled because she's talking to her best friend, who I forgot to mention earlier. She's talking to Charlotte, and she gets startled, and Mr. Darcy's like, I want to dance with you. Can I dance with you at the next dance? And she's like, sure, out of panic. And she's like, what did I just agree to? Oh no, oh no. And she ends up dancing with Mr. Darcy. And you have to keep in mind, a dance is like 30 minutes long. And so you're sitting there and she's just talking with him with this brilliant banter. This was one of my favorite chapters. The banter was just amazing. He was trying to flirt with her and tell her that he liked her, essentially, and he's like, well, we could talk about books, and she's like, I don't think we like the same books, like, I know. And he's like, okay. And we get this sort of tension, and they're just dancing, and it's the first time he's ever been able to touch her, holding hands or her waist or anything. And so he's very distracted, and she's very angry because she's just heard this whole story from Wickham, who also was supposed to show up to this ball and presumably was called away on work. And Mr. Darcy and him are just not on good terms at this point in the book. I don't think they're ever on good terms in the entire book, but that's for later. Though we have this ball, Lizzie is really like upset by the end, and there's just been a whole bunch of embarrassing things from the Bennet family, and the next day, or shortly after, we find out that Bingley has gone back to town, back to London, with all of his party, and he doesn't have intention of returning. This is from his sister Caroline to Jane, and Jane is broken-hearted. She just loved Bingley so much, and now he's gone. And we begin our moment where we're like, oh no, they're not gonna get together. Darcy's gone, and that makes us happy because he's been such a horrible human being in Hertfordshire. And we end up getting to see a little bit of a romance. Romance is the wrong word. Mr. Collins pursues Lizzie, and he ends up making this proposal to her, which is so outrightly terrible, and oh, there are just so many things he did wrong that I could just rant on for hours. He just was so terrible, and he insulted her and said, basically, I'm your only chance at having, like, your family saved in this house, and she flat out rejected him 3 to 4 times, I think, and he just wasn't getting it. And this is one of my favorite parts of the book too. Her mother goes into Mr. Bennet's office, and she's like, Lizzie's not gonna have Mr. Collins, and soon Mr. Collins won't have Lizzie. And he's like, what am I to do about it? And she's like, talk to her. And so he ends up going out, and Mrs. Bennet follows them, and they're talking, and he's like, well, Lizzie, from now on, you're going to be a stranger to one of your parents, right? And the mom nods. If you do not marry Mr. Collins, your mother will never speak to you again, and I will never speak to you if you do. And it was so brilliant, and Lizzie's just so happy that he stuck up for her, and they took off the proposal, but Mr. Collins stayed the rest of the time that he was going to, even though it was so awkward with her family, and they ended up having such awkward moments throughout the rest of the week, and he ended up secretly proposing to Charlotte Lucas, who is Lizzie's best friend. And Lizzie is really upset when she finds out. She can't believe it. And by the end of figuring out that they're engaged, Mr. Collins has to go back to Rosings and has to tell Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and we have this tension with the Lucases now. And it takes a while for Charlotte to actually leave, get married and leave, and Jane is at this point really brokenhearted, and Mrs. Bennet's brother and sister-in-law are over at the house, and they've got little kids running around, and she kind of talks to Mr. and Mrs. Gardner are some of my favorite characters in this book as well. They had some of my favorite moments, I gotta be honest. And Mrs. Gardner is talking to Lizzie, and she says, I don't think you should believe everything that Wickham says. Like, I don't know if we should believe everything that he's portraying and saying about Mr. Darcy, because now he's just outright telling everyone, since Darcy's gone, that he's done this wrong to him. And Lizzie's like, oh, I don't know, I'm not really leading him on, I'm just, we're just hanging out and at my house like all the time and getting to be good, really good friends. So Mrs. Gardner and Lizzie end up deciding that Jane, because she's so brokenhearted, should actually go with them back to London, back to town for a while, so that she can get her mind off of it, she can hang out with the little kids and just be embraced in London. And Lizzie thinks this is a great idea because Jane's just been so brokenhearted. And so Jane leaves with them, and Lizzie ends up going to Rosings, which is where some of my favorite moments happen as well. And we go to Rosings, and there we're greeted by the Collinses, and she also comes with Charlotte's little sister and her father. And they get to see all the house, and Charlotte talks about how she has this room to herself, and they see this garden that Mr. Collins works on all the time, and it's just, there's a lot going on, and Lizzie is a little bit sad that her friend got married to this guy that's kind of awful, but she understands that Charlotte is very practical, and this was a very practical decision. And she ended up staying at Rosings for quite a long time. Well, not at Rosings, where the Collinses live next to Rosings. And they end up going to meet Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is so awful to Lizzie. She's so high-end, believes that everyone below her rank in society is just not even human for the most part, and she's disgusted by Lizzie's upbringing and all this other stuff, and she ends up being so rude to her, but we have a surprise visit from Mr. Darcy and his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, who I love. There's some great moments with Colonel Fitzwilliam. I really appreciate him as a character, and Mr. Darcy startles Lizzie, but they end up having some fun moments, and he ends up actually walking her home a lot, and ends up coming and visiting the Lucases a lot, and talking to her, and she doesn't get the hint. She still thinks he hates her, and she hates him, and that's just how it is. And she heard from Colonel Fitzwilliam that Mr. Darcy just broke off this unopportune engagement with his friend. We don't mention that it's Bingley, but it's highly implied that it's Bingley. That he was interested in someone below his rank, and that their family was inferior. And she is infuriated. She's so mad about it, and she ends up having like this headache. And she lets the Lucases go to Rosings without her for tea, and she sits there, the Lucases and the Collins, and she sits in the house, and she's like kind of taking a minute to adjust to the fact that Darcy broke up her sister and Bingley. And Mr. Darcy shows up at her house, and we're like, oh my goodness, what is happening? And he asks if she's all right because he heard she had a headache and that she was unwell. She's like, I'm doing better. She's still pretty angry. And he ends up proposing to her. And it's one of the best things in this book. Oh my goodness. And I can't rave enough about how he says it and how she reacts, because there's some just great lines. I found there are some lines in this chapter. I just love the whole thing, but I'm going to read some sections, some famous sections. Tim wants to say hi. Tim, say hi. Yeah. Don't mind him. Alright, so, in vain I have struggled, it will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. And Elizabeth's astonishment was beyond expression, is the next line in this book. And then he goes on to say, he roasts her family. He says, your family is horrible, they're an embarrassment to you, your society is terrible, but I can't help but love you, so please accept my proposal. And she's like, absolutely not. Not after I just found out what you did to Bingley and my sister. Like, absolutely not. And so she is furious. And he's like, is this all the, this is all the reply which I am to have the honor of expecting? I might perhaps wish to be informed why, with so little endeavour at civility, I was thus rejected, but it is of small importance. And they go on to talk about how Wickham and his misfortunes, and Darcy's like, oh, his misfortunes are great indeed, and she's like, he doesn't have the honor of your friendship, and he's like, well, and he doesn't deny that he broke up Bingley and Jane. And there's one line at the bottom of this proposal scene, which goes on for a chapter, that I just love, that I'm going to read. You could not have made me an offer of your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it. And I just love that. It just sets the tone right then and there. And he pretty much leaves the house and goes away, and she's devastated, and she runs to her room and she's just crying. And the next day she goes for her walk, and she tries to avoid the places that she usually walks, and he ends up finding her, and he's like, would you do me the honor of reading this letter? And he gives her a letter, and in it, it's literally a whole chapter, just the letter, and it debunks a lot of stuff. He doesn't apologize for breaking up Bingley and Jane, but he does say it was his fault, and he explains the Wickham story, which is a whole scandal and just excitement, and this part of the book I just couldn't stop reading. Oh my goodness. He says that Wickham he was wanting to pursue law, and so Darcy ended up giving him the money that his father had told him to set aside for him, and he gave it to him, and he ended up wasting it, pretty much. He ended up loitering it in many uses, probably drinking, gambling, all the works, and he really just was terrible, and he didn't use his money for further education at all. And Darcy was really like, okay, now that I've given you this money, we're just not gonna talk or relate to each other or have anything to do with each other for a very long time. And so he forgets about him, and then like last summer, kind of pretty much right before we meet Mr. Darcy in the original, at the beginning of the book, he says that he was away for the summer, and his little sister, Georgiana, was in their summer residence, and she was with a guardian and a governess, I think. And this person betrayed them, and she let Wickham into this house, and he started courting Georgiana and convinced her to elope with him. Now, eloping in this time era is very different. Essentially, he was going to promise to elope her simply so that he could get the money, her fortune that she would inherit once she was of age. And Darcy thankfully returned from his trip early. I know, Tim. Returned from his trip early and ended up catching them right before the elopement, because she's telling him all about it, and she's so excited and thinks she's in love. And Wickham flees, and it's a huge deal. And Elizabeth is just reading this letter, walking around the park, and she's reading the first bit, and she closes the letter and storms around, and she's like, I'm not gonna read it. And then she opens it again out of curiosity and just continues reading. Me too, girl. Regardless, she continues reading this letter, and she reads it over several times, and she goes home to Charlotte's house, and she goes up to her room, and she's just crying, and she can't believe what she's read, and she's just in shock. And that's kind of where we end Pemberley, where we end Rosings, and Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam leave. And it wasn't, like, when she was reading the letter, they have left. And shortly after that, Lizzie goes home, and she is greeted by her family, and she's also been visiting, she visited Jane on her way to Charlotte's house, and she visited Jane on her way back, and she ended up bringing Jane home when they went home together. And Jane's feeling a lot better, but she had some struggles in London with her love life. She went to see Caroline because she knew she was in town, and she went to see her and she said, "I'm in town." And when she came to visit her weeks after she said she would, it was this rude visit, and she couldn't believe she had been blindsided by this person. And Jane actually had a strong opinion for like the first time in the entire book. And Lizzie didn't have the heart to tell her that Bingley was separated from her because of Darcy, and that he didn't know, and that's a whole other thing. But she tells him about Wickham, and she's just struck, and they kind of make fun of it for a bit, and they're like, "How could we have been deceived?" And the truth is, we don't know how you were deceived. However, he's charming. He was very, very charming, and he's got that going for him. So after we kind of get things a little bit settled with Jane and Lizzie back at home, we leave for a trip with Lizzie to, they were going to go see the lakes and the mountains with her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardner. However, that trip delayed and they had to shorten their trip, so they ended up going to the lakes and around Pemberley, which is where Mr. Darcy lives. And Mr. Darcy is not supposed to be home, and her aunt is convinced that they need to go and see Pemberley inside the house, in the gardens, and it's just amazing. And Lizzie is really reluctant, which I don't blame her, girl. I would not want to go there too after the proposal again, and like, oh my goodness. And she ends up going because this maid said that he wouldn't be home, and he wasn't for the beginning. And the manager of the house, she shows them around, and Lizzie ends up staring at this painting of him for literally like 30 minutes, and she's just thinking about him and thinking about how much she feels bad, and she's like actually like, oh my goodness, he's not as awful of a person as I was thinking. And she ends up thinking, I could have been the mistress of this house and all of that good stuff. And she's really upset, and she ends up looking outside. Well, they're ending up leaving to go walk around, and she runs into Mr. Darcy, who's very polite and not prideful and just really trying to be a decent human being around her. And it's just so great, Timothy. Just so great. And he is just talking with her. Yeah? You happy, buddy? He ends up talking with her about how her aunt and uncle are, and he ends up saying that her uncle can fish in the pond whenever he wants, and her uncle kind of dismisses this, and they move on, and they end up walking around this area for a long time, and Darcy ends up changing quick, running out to see Lizzie and being like, "Hey, actually, my sister's coming tomorrow. I would love to introduce you." And she's like, "I guess," and so they end up going back to where they were staying, and the next day, Mr. Darcy shows up there, and he's got Georgiana with him, and she's a very shy girl, very under a lot of rules, and she's very sweet, and very polite to Lizzie, and she clearly really likes her. And we're talking, and Mr. Darcy's like, "Oh, I don't know if Bingley's gonna show up. He might not be here." And we hear like this happy trotting up the stairs, and it's Bingley, and he just, when he shows up, he has this moment where he talks about the exact date that he last saw Jane, and it was the Netherfield Ball on September, I can't remember the date, and he remembers it exactly, and he brings up Jane casually throughout the conversation. Well, casually, in quotations, it's Bingley, he can't exactly be that casual, and he is so cute. I missed Bingley through this chunk of the book where we just didn't see him. He's just a light and a joy in this book at all times. And so he ends up saying that he really wants to come back and see Netherfield, and they get invited to dinner the next night. But Lizzie gets this letter the next day after they've had dinner. And they've had dinner and Caroline's being super snarky and she's just being awful. However, Darcy and Lizzie are they're having a gay old time. And when she gets back, and the next morning, she's kind of going through her letters, and Jane had sent 2 letters. One got redirected because Jane had marked it terribly, and they were about Lydia, who, I forgot to mention, had gone off with the regiment to the place where they were moving. I can't remember the name of where it was called. One moment. They go to Brighton, and Lydia has gone with Colonel Forrester and his wife, who she's really good friends with. And we get this letter, and Jane's like, so don't be distressed, but Lydia has run away with Wickham. They're gonna go to Scotland to get married, well, elope. And Lizzie's like, oh no. Jane's like, don't worry about it, we're just gonna kind of let it be. Colonel Forrester's gone after them. And so we let that sit for a moment, and she opens up the second letter, and in it, she's like, actually, can you bring Uncle now? She's not gonna elope. We're afraid that he's literally just sleeping with her to just sleep with her. We actually don't know by the end of the book. We think it's probably just to get back at Lizzie, maybe, as to why he did this with Lydia. Because it's not exactly like she's gonna entail this large fortune, but still, we have this moment of panic, and Lizzie is just freaking out and crying, and she runs out, and she actually runs into Mr. Darcy, who came to see her, which is sweet in of itself, but she's sobbing, which is not normal for a young lady to do in front of a man, and she's crying, and she tells him what's going on, and he's like, okay, I'll go get your aunt and uncle, and do you need wine, because you look really upset? And she's like, I'm fine. Finish. We're all fine. We're all crying, but it will be fine in the end. Anyways, so she's really upset, and they end up going back to Longbourn. She's talking with Jane about the particulars and how Lydia left a note saying she was so excited to become Mrs. Wickham, and they were afraid that they were never going to get Lydia back and she was going to ruin their reputation, which is a very realistic fear in this time period. And she goes back to the natural rhythm she has with Jane, and they are just kind of just trying to fight through this scary feeling of the fact that they're all going to be never going to be able to find husbands because their names have been pulled through the mud. And Lydia it's just a silly girl, and she doesn't know what she's doing. And a few chapters later, her dad comes home, and Mr. Gardner's still out looking for her, and we end up getting this letter a little bit later to Mr. Bennet, saying that he's found them, and he's going to make them marry for this amount, and it's quite low. It's like $5,000 a year, which is not a lot in comparison to what he should have asked for. And so he's like, I believe that your uncle may have bailed us out here, and he may have paid him a lot of money. And so Lydia gets married. She comes back with Wickham, and it's really awkward, and Lizzie just tries to let it go, but their names are kind of saved. Kind of. People will forget about it eventually-ish. So Lydia and Wickham leave, and Lydia is really just being a silly girl, and she didn't think she affected the family at all, which is so stupid on Lydia's part. And we get back to Lizzie and Jane, and guess who shows up at Netherfield? It's Bingley and Darcy. And we're just so excited, and they end up actually coming to Longbourn and saying hello to the girls, and they come several times, and Darcy ends up going to town for a little bit, and Bingley actually proposes to Jane, and it's one of the sweetest things, and Jane and Lizzie are just so excited, and Lizzie and Bingley become good friends. They're super excited that Bingley has proposed, and Jane's really happy, and they're just kind of getting together as a family and settling. And one morning shows up Catherine de Bourgh, who likes to throw a wrench in things, and she comes under the opinion that her nephew has proposed to Elizabeth, which is completely true. However, she thinks she's below him. And she tells her all these horrible things, and she's so mean to her in this garden, this iconic garden scene, and she's so rude to their family, and she basically is like, are you engaged to him or not? And Lizzie's like, I am not. She's like, will you promise me to never enter into such an engagement? And Lizzie's like, I will not. You are being so rude to me. You've offended me in every way possible. And Lady Catherine de Bourgh leaves. And the next day, Darcy shows up, and he's like, so, I heard that you might be into me. Have your feelings changed since we last had this topic? If not, then I'll just let it drop forever. Sadness. Just pure sadness. But she says that they have changed, and they end up getting proposed and married by the end of the book, and they end up living in Pemberley next to Jane and Bingley, and it's just this really sweet ending. And I love this book so much, and I'm gonna just say that it is iconic for reasons, for so many reasons, and I will definitely be rereading this. I only caught so many things, and I was also listening to Pride and Prejudice. I will link them down below while I read through it, and that was so interesting and fun, and I definitely recommend it when I was reading this. And that helped bring some context and some fun aspects to the story that I didn't get otherwise. And I am so excited to continue reading Jane Austen and doing book reviews here on this channel. That's the summary of this book. You should read this book because it's so beautifully written, and the plot is just amazing, and the characters are out of this world. So if you're really into a romantic kind of book and a fun read, this is not an easy read, but it is a fun read. I would definitely recommend this book. And if you just love Jane Austen, any of her other books, and you haven't read this one, I highly recommend it. So thank you so much for listening to me rant about this book. I'm hoping to do some more booktube content here on the channel. I will be posting a YouTube release schedule over on my Instagram sometime in the next couple weeks so that you'll know what upcoming videos are coming out. And I will see you guys next week with another video. Bye.